The NHL is horrified of this, as The Athletic has just revealed their top 100 list of NHL prospects, and there are a lot of Islanders players really high in that list. We're going to discuss the rankings on this episode of Islanders Digest. I'm going to give my thoughts on each player's ranking. I think some of them are honestly a little bit high. There's also a player who I think should have been mentioned in the top 100 that was not given credit. We're going to get into all that on this episode of Islanders Digest. Talk about what this means for the Islanders' future, especially considering they did not bottom out to get this list of prospects, which means they still have a pretty competitive team currently in the NHL, which makes this even more exciting. I do want to thank all of you who have already subscribed to the channel. We're getting really close to our goal of 2,000 subscribers, and I appreciate all your support as we continue to make Islanders content throughout the summer. With that, let's get into this Islanders prospect list. And yeah, the Islanders have a lot of prospects on this list from The Athletic. Unfortunately, we cannot show the full list from The Athletic. It is a paid article. I highly recommend, if you are interested in prospects in the NHL in general, to check out the full list from The Athletic. But from an Islanders perspective, this is really encouraging to see. The list has Matthew Schaefer as the #1 prospect in the entire NHL. Victor Eklund, even more excitingly, is number 21. They then have Calum Ritchie at 31, Cole Eiserman at 32, and Kashawn Aitcheson at 34. So, yeah. 5 Islanders, not even just in the top 100, in the top 50, really the top 40. That is really impressive, especially when you consider there are 32 teams in this league. Considering the Islanders have 4 of the top 32 prospects, that is really encouraging for the future of this team, especially considering The Athletic is pretty neutral when it comes to teams and their prospect pools. If anything, a lot of times the Islanders are sometimes disrespected by The Athletic, so it's really nice to see they really enjoy this prospect pool. Now, I will say, I do think some of these rankings are a little off, and when you're ranking every single prospect pool in the NHL, it can be really challenging to compare these guys, and a lot of times players are real close. Let's start off with Matthew Schaefer, who was ranked #1 on this list. I honestly feel like Matthew Schaefer is the second best prospect in the NHL, just considering how young he is. Don't get on me in the comments. I love Matthew Schaefer. I think he's going to be an incredible player for the Islanders. I do think he is the best defensive prospect in the entire NHL. I do think, though, Ivan Demidov from the Montreal Canadiens is a bit more polished, and considering he has played some NHL games, I think it's fair for him, at least right now, to be the top NHL prospect. And then once he graduates, because he's definitely going to be making the NHL this year, then I do think it is Matthew Schaefer. And that's another thing to note with this Islanders prospect pool. It's only going to get better. And you might see in a lot of prospect ranking lists, the Islanders are more typically around the 7 to 10 ranking. I think that's honestly because I think with some of these rankings, there's too much emphasis on overall depth of a prospect pool rather than just who you have in your top 5. Personally, I would rather have the best top 5, and I think the Islanders have one of, if not the best top 5 in the NHL. Really, the only other prospect pools in the entire league I would consider switching for the Islanders are either the prospect pool of the San Jose Sharks or the Chicago Blackhawks. And considering how many years of bottoming out they had to do to acquire those prospect pools, this is just so encouraging for the future of the Islanders. So realistically, I think Schaefer should be around 2. Now, Victor Eklund at 21, I actually think is a perfect ranking. The Athletic, some people were frustrated, had him above several other prospects that went earlier than him in the draft. And I think this is right. Just because those prospects were drafted earlier because they're centers or because they're 6'2" does not make them better players. I think Eklund is an incredible hockey player. Again, I have been raving about how excited I was that the Islanders drafted him with their second pick in the first round. And a lot of Islander fans might be surprised to see Victor Eklund ahead of Calum Ritchie and Cole Eiserman. Personally, I think this is the right ranking. I think when we first got Eklund, people just assumed he was the fourth best prospect behind Cole Eiserman. No, I truly believe that Victor Eklund has a higher ceiling than both Calum Ritchie and Cole Eiserman. And just with the all-round game he plays, I also think while he is a year further out, considering he was just drafted 2 weeks ago, I do think he also has a higher floor, and I cannot wait to see what Victor Eklund does for the New York Islanders. Now, the third ranking that's really interesting is Calum Ritchie at 31. Some people might be frustrated with this ranking, considering Calum Ritchie in previous rankings has been higher. I do want to point out the previous rankings for Calum Ritchie were before the draft, and you were not including prospects like Schaefer, Misa, Hagens in those previous rankings. I think 31 is a really fair ranking for Calum Ritchie, and considering they got a prospect of this quality for Brock Nelson in a rental deal. I know Nelson ended up signing for the Avalanche, which I think kept them from absolutely having a terrible return. But still, getting Calum Ritchie in a trade like that was a masterclass from Lou Lamoriello. Perhaps the best move he made for the Islanders. We'll see how this pans out in the future. Again, with all these prospects, one thing I do want to keep in mind is just the way this works. Not all 5 of these players are going to pan out. The odds are one of them might become a bust, or at least not hit the potential that we are expecting. Perhaps a player like Calum Ritchie, instead of being the first or second line center that we envision, he ends up being a third line center. That's just the nature of prospects. None of these guys are sure things, but having 5 of the top 40 prospects in the NHL gives you a really good chance that you're going to have some real difference makers in the near future. I honestly think Schaefer and even Eklund are in the category of I don't think they can miss, and we'll see what happens with the rest. I have high hopes for all of them, but just keeping it out there. Like there's no guarantee that all these guys are going to hit, which is why it's so important to have 5 prospects of this caliber. When you only have 1 or 2 of these guys, when one of them doesn't pan out, it's a really big deal. But considering all the depth the Islanders have, if a guy such as Kashawn Aicheson doesn't turn out to be what the Islanders hoped, and he instead becomes like a third pair defenseman or perhaps a fringe NHLer, it's not as big as a blow. And what's even more exciting for the Islanders is they also have 2 picks in the first round of next year. Part of that was from the Calum Ritchie trade. I think Calum Ritchie at 31 is a fair ranking. I think it's interesting that Cole Eiserman is right behind him. I honestly wonder if I would flip these 2 players. I think Calum Ritchie has the higher floor in that even though he doesn't put up explosive numbers, and obviously he's putting up a ton of points, 70 points in 47 games is nothing to scoff at. But considering it is in the OHL, I don't think Calum Ritchie has as high of an offensive ceiling, but I think he has a higher floor. And as for Cole Eiserman, I'm really interested to see what he does next year in Boston University. What he did this year was really impressive, putting up 36 points. I have no doubt at the bare minimum he can be an elite power play player in the NHL. But what I'm really looking to see with Cole Eiserman is, can he take the next step? Can he compete for be one of the players who is in contention for the Hobie Baker Award next year in college? Considering where he's ranked at 32, he's expected to be in that range, and it's going to be really exciting to see Cole Eiserman. I think he has more offensive potential than Calum Ritchie. I think I honestly, personally, would switch Eiserman and Ritchie in the ranking. It's really close. I think a lot of scouts really respect Calum Ritchie's all-around game, and they just think that he is going to translate really well to the NHL, and I believe so too. I just think Cole Eiserman has so much more potential. And then at 34, this is honestly the biggest shocking ranking in this list. Having Kashawn Aicheson at 34, I'm going to be honest, I do think this is a little bit high for Kashawn Aitcheson. This is not a knock on him at all. I think there were just some other players on this list that were disrespected when he was put 34. Still, I would say there is no doubt that Kashawn Aitcheson is a top 45 prospect in the NHL. I think if I was doing this ranking, I would probably have him around that range. Still very impressive, and considering he was just drafted, there's still plenty of room for him to jump up this ranking. When Calum Ritchie was first drafted, he was not the 31st best prospect in the NHL. He earned that over time, really improving his stock, and it's going to be really interesting going into the season if these players can improve their stocks even further, or perhaps if a player like Calum Ritchie is able to make the jump out into the NHL right away. One player I will say I think was left off this list, and I think he still deserves a place, is Danny Nelson. He was on this list, I believe, a year ago. He was in the 90 to 100 range, and that's where I still think he should be. I think some of Danny Nelson's stock has been taken away because he hasn't taken a step up in terms of his numbers in college, but from what we've seen, I think he still belongs on this list. I'm pretty sure Isaiah George was not eligible for this list because of the amount of games he played in the NHL, although I think if he was eligible, I think he also should be considered towards the 95 to 100 range. Still, though, it is very impressive for the Islanders to have so many prospects in really the top 50 of the NHL. And I think when their prospect pool gets ranked and it's more in this 7 to 9 range, again, I think that's because they don't have as many of these guys in the 60 to 100 range. They are very top heavy in this prospect pool, at least in terms of the top prospect pools in the NHL. Having 5 elite prospects like this does put you in the top 10 of the league. It gives you a very incredible prospect pool when compared to teams like the Chicago Blackhawks and San Jose Sharks, who have just been picking multiple times in the first round every single year. I think it's really hard to beat teams like that, or teams like even Montreal, who are coming out of a rebuild but still have plenty of picks from when they were formerly one of the worst teams in the league. Still, considering the Islanders did this all in 18 months, as this post by Ryan does remind us, this is absolutely incredible work by the Islanders. Again, 18 months ago, none of these prospects were in the Islanders system. So considering how far the Islanders have come in terms of their prospect pool, this is very impressive. And I'm really curious to see if any other Islanders prospects jump into this list this season. Let me know in the comments below which of these prospects are your favorite for the Islanders, and what do you think of these rankings? You think I'm off saying that Schaefer should probably be second overall, thinking that he is the #1 prospect? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. My name is Patrick Nilan. Catch you on the next episode of Islanders Digest. Let's go, Islanders!